The year was 1967. The place? A windowless conference room inside the Pentagon, beneath the fluorescent hum of the third-floor E-ring. Robert McNamara, United States Secretary of Defense, sat alone with a classified document stamped with words no one outside the building would read for another 4 years. It was the first completed section of what would later be known as the Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page internal history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, commissioned by McNamara himself. The report's conclusion was not subtle. The war, it said, was unwinnable. The United States had already lost more than 15,000 soldiers. The enemy was not weakening. The strategy was failing. McNamara read it. He understood it. And then he ordered more troops. Over the next 8 years, 43,000 more Americans would die in a war their own defense secretary knew, in a locked room on a Tuesday afternoon, could not be won. This is not a story about cowardice. McNamara was not a coward. He was not stupid. He was not even particularly corrupt by the standards of his time. This is a story about something far more dangerous. A bias so deeply wired into human psychology that it has toppled governments, buried billion-dollar companies, and kept ordinary people trapped in bad marriages, failing businesses, and careers they hate. Not despite everything they have sacrificed, but because of it. This is the story of escalation of commitment. In 1985, psychologists Hal Arkus and Catherine Bloomer published a study that would become one of the most cited papers in behavioral economics. They gave participants a simple scenario. Imagine you have bought a $100 ski ticket to Michigan. You have also bought a $50 ticket to a resort in Wisconsin, which you later realize you would actually prefer. Both tickets are non-refundable. The trips are on the same weekend. Which do you go to? The rational answer is Wisconsin. You chose it because it is better. The past money is gone either way. But the majority of participants chose Michigan. The reason? They had spent more money on it. Here is what makes this so strange. The money you have already spent cannot come back. The rational mind knows this, but the emotional mind refuses to accept it. To abandon Michigan feels like admitting the $100 was wasted. To keep going feels like there is still a chance to get your money's worth. This is the trap, and it does not weaken when the stakes get higher. Research suggests it gets worse. Barry Staw at the University of California, Berkeley spent years studying this under the name Escalation of Commitment. In 1976, in a paper titled Knee-Deep in the Big Muddy, he described a pattern repeating across organizations large and small. Once people commit resources to a course of action, they become more committed the more those resources fail to produce results. The logic of the outside world says, stop, cut your losses. The logic of the committed decision-maker says, we have come too far. We cannot stop now. By the time McNamara read those classified pages in 1967, the United States was spending over $20 billion per year on the war in Vietnam. Over 500,000 American soldiers were deployed. To stop now would mean admitting that every dollar, every life, every political speech about containing communism had been a mistake. It would mean facing the grief of every family that had already lost someone and telling them it was for nothing. And so it continued. President Johnson escalated. Then Nixon escalated. The bombing campaigns grew larger. The body counts grew larger. The classified reports kept saying the same thing. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. The public finally saw what the government had known for years. The war continued for another 4 years. The final tally? 58,220 American soldiers killed, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians dead. The total financial cost? Over $840 billion in today's dollars. In 1975, Saigon fell. The outcome the Pentagon had privately predicted in 1967 arrived 8 years later, surrounded by catastrophically more suffering. This is what escalation of commitment looks like at national scale. Not a single dramatic bad decision, a series of smaller decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one pulling the entire system deeper into a hole it was too invested to climb out of. Why did no one stop it? When we make a decision and invest in it, that decision becomes part of our identity. To reverse it is not just to change course. It is to publicly admit that the person you were when you made the decision was wrong. For a private individual, this is embarrassing. For a politician, it can be career-ending. For a government, it can feel like a national humiliation. Leon Festinger, who developed cognitive dissonance theory in the 1950s, showed that when our actions contradict our beliefs, we do not update our beliefs. We distort reality until the contradiction disappears. We tell ourselves new stories. The investment is almost paying off. The evidence against us is biased. Just a little more time. Festinger studied a doomsday cult in 1954 whose leader predicted the world would end on a specific night. When the night passed without incident, the believers became more fervent. They began proselytizing to strangers. The failed prediction, rather than destroying their commitment, deepened it. The mechanism is identical to what happened in Vietnam. The bigger the investment, the more fiercely the mind fights to justify it. There is another layer, one that Kahneman and Tversky identified through their work on prospect theory. Losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. Once you are in a losing position, accepting that loss is so painful that you will take riskier and riskier bets to try to recover to zero. This is escalation of commitment's psychological engine. You are not pouring good money after bad because you are stupid. You are doing it because stopping hurts more than continuing, even when continuing is objectively worse. On a gray English morning in 1976, the angular white fuselage of Concorde rolled onto the Heathrow tarmac for its first commercial flight. It was one of the great technological achievements of the 20th century. It was also a financial catastrophe that both the British and French governments knew was coming, and had known since at least 1962. The Concorde program began in 1956 with a joint British-French agreement to develop a supersonic passenger aircraft. By the early 1960s, costs were already running over projections. The sonic boom meant it could never fly supersonically over populated land. The range was too short for most transoceanic routes. The airlines mostly canceled their orders. Only 14 Concordes were ever sold commercially, all to Air France and British Airways under enormous government pressure and with permanent operating subsidies. In 1962, there was already a compelling argument to stop. But each year, another tranche of money had been committed. By 1965, stopping would embarrass two governments. By 1969, when the prototype flew, the investment had created its own gravity. The phrase sunk cost fallacy entered academic literature partly because of Concorde. In some papers, it is literally called the Concorde effect. Concorde flew for 27 years, finally retired in 2003, not because governments did the math, but because an Air France crash in 2000 made the insurance economics impossible. The program cost an estimated $20 to $25 billion in today's dollars. In January 2007, Steve Jobs held a sleek black rectangle on stage at Moscone Center in San Francisco and told the crowd Apple was going to reinvent the phone. At Nokia's headquarters in Espoo, Finland, the senior engineers already knew what it meant. Internal documents show that Nokia's own R&D teams had been warning about touchscreen, internet-connected devices since the early 2000s. Nokia had prototype touchscreen devices as early as 2004. But Nokia was not just a company. It was a national institution. At its peak, Nokia accounted for roughly 4% of Finland's entire GDP. Its feature phones owned over 40% of the global mobile market. To pivot away from feature phones would have meant admitting that the billions invested in feature phone infrastructure, the Symbian operating system, the manufacturing supply chains, the brand identity itself, all of it was now obsolete. So they did not pivot. They adjusted. Incremental improvements to Symbian. Small touchscreen features bolted onto existing form factors. A belated partnership with Microsoft that arrived 5 years too late. By 2012, Nokia's global smartphone share had fallen to under 5%. In 2013, Microsoft acquired Nokia's handset division for $7.2 billion, an acquisition later written off as nearly a total loss. In the year 2000, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings traveled to Dallas to meet Blockbuster CEO John Antioco. Netflix had about 300,000 subscribers and was losing money. Hastings proposed that Blockbuster acquire Netflix for $50 million. Antioco reportedly laughed him out of the room. This was not arrogance alone. It was escalation of commitment. Blockbuster had 9,000 stores, 60,000 employees, and had been investing for a decade in physical rental infrastructure. The late fee model alone generated hundreds of millions annually. To say yes to Netflix would have been to say, every store, every lease, every employee, all of that investment is now the wrong bet. Strategically, that was exactly the right call. Emotionally and institutionally, it was nearly impossible. Blockbuster kept investing in stores. Their competing service launched 4 years too late. When they eliminated late fees in 2005, it cost $400 million in annual revenue. When a new CEO reversed the online strategy and recommitted to physical stores, the fate was sealed. In 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. Netflix had 20 million subscribers. Today, Netflix has over 260 million. The $50 million acquisition, laughed off in 2000, would have been one of the most profitable investments in entertainment history. By now, you might think, these are all organizations. Surely individuals are more rational. Consider this honestly. You are 6 seasons deep into a television series. The first 3 were excellent. The last 3 have been terrible. But the finale is next week. Will you watch it? Of course. You have invested too much to stop. You have been going to a gym for 3 months. You hate it. But you paid for the annual membership in January, and it feels wrong to waste it. So you go. You have been in a relationship for 4 years. The chemistry has been gone for 2 of them. You have stayed not because you love where it is going, but because of everything you have built together. A 2016 study in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making found that people who had invested significantly in a relationship rated it as more valuable than people who had not, even when objective quality indicators were held constant. The investment itself inflated the perceived value. You do not just fail to leave bad situations. You start to genuinely believe they are better than they are. Let us be precise about the mechanisms. The first is loss aversion. Losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. When you stop an investment, you crystallize a loss. You make it real and final. Continuing feels like preserving the possibility of recovery. The second is self-justification. Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson documented how people construct elaborate narratives to make past choices seem wise. The more public the commitment, the more intricate the self-justification becomes. The third is the completion compulsion, the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished tasks create persistent mental discomfort. Finishing, even badly, feels like relief. The fourth is optimism bias. People systematically overestimate their chances of future success. When your investment is failing, you unconsciously inflate the remaining odds. These four mechanisms work in concert. Loss aversion makes stopping painful. Self-justification rewrites history. Completion compulsion keeps you focused on a finish line you may never reach. Optimism bias makes that finish line look closer than it is. For most of human evolutionary history, persistence was exactly the right strategy. The tribe that abandoned its crops at the first drought died. The problem is that the modern world has given us instruments that can amplify persistence into catastrophe at civilizational scale. Not all persistence is irrational. Amazon lost money for 9 years before becoming the most profitable retail company in history. James Dyson made 5,127 prototypes before arriving at the one that worked. So, how do you tell the difference between rational persistence and escalation of commitment? The research suggests 3 diagnostic markers. First, are you continuing because the fundamentals support it, or purely because you have already invested? McNamara's reports showed the war was unwinnable. Nokia's engineers showed the smartphone threat was accelerating. When the fundamentals say stop, and you continue because of prior investment alone, that is the fallacy. Second, are you making a new decision or prolonging an old one? Ask yourself, if I were encountering this for the first time today with no prior investment, would I start it? Third, who is evaluating? The person who made the original commitment or someone with no stake? Fresh evaluators are dramatically more likely to recommend stopping. In December 1978, a United Airlines DC-8 was approaching Portland, Oregon. Captain Malburn McBroom had become fixated on a landing gear malfunction. The flight engineer repeatedly flagged the fuel gauges. McBroom kept circling. He was committed to solving the gear problem first. The aircraft ran out of fuel 10 miles from the runway. 10 passengers died. That crash helped introduce crew resource management into commercial aviation, training that formally empowers a first officer to override a committed captain. Aviation recognized that individual psychology alone could not overcome escalation of commitment, so they redesigned the system to force interruptions. This is the most effective intervention the research supports. Not willpower, structural interruption. In practical terms, this means pre-committing to exit criteria before you begin. If revenue is not positive by Q3, not if things are not going well. You move the evaluation into the calmer present, before commitment accumulates its weight. It means separating the decision-maker from the person who made the original commitment. McNamara was not the right person to evaluate the war he had championed. And it means reframing the decision as a new one. Instead of, should I stop something I have already started, ask, if I were encountering this for the first time today, would I choose it? Robert McNamara died in 2009 at the age of 93. In his final years, he said, "We were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why." He understood in the end, but understanding came 40 years after the classified report landed on his desk. The question is never whether you will understand eventually. The question is whether you will understand in time. In your own life, the escalations are rarely $100 ski tickets. They are years of education in a field you have quietly stopped believing in. They are businesses that stopped being meaningful 3 years ago, but that you have poured your savings and identity into. They are friendships maintained entirely out of historical obligation. The sunk cost fallacy does not announce itself. It disguises itself as loyalty, as persistence, as not being a quitter. These are, in other contexts, genuine virtues. That is precisely what makes the trap so effective. The antidote is not cynicism. It is not the reflexive abandonment of every project at the first sign of difficulty. The antidote is a single question, asked honestly, asked regularly, asked especially in the moments when you feel most committed. If I did not have a single dollar or a single day already sunk into this, would I choose it right now? If the answer is yes, continue. The investment and the present judgment are aligned. If the answer is no, you already have your answer. The only question remaining is whether you are brave enough to act on it before the cost climbs any higher. McNamara was not. Nokia was not. Blockbuster was not. You can be different, but only if you ask the question before the room goes quiet and the classified report lands on your desk, and you reach one more time for the pen.